It wasn't the phone that woke me at 4:15 in the morning. It was the thud, a heavy, wet sound against the iron gate of my cottage, barely audible over the relentless Pacific Northwest downpour. I didn't panic. I didn't call out. I just pulled on my boots and walked into the storm. There, sitting in the mud, was my 78-year-old grandmother, Margaret. Next to her were 3 heavy-duty black garbage bags soaked through with rain. No suitcases. Just trash bags. My parents hadn't just dropped her off, they had discarded her. They thought they were clearing space for their golden boy. They didn't realize they had just thrown away the landlord who owned the roof over their heads. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't ask questions. Questions take time, and hypothermia doesn't wait for answers. I grabbed the first black garbage bag. It was slick with mud and rain, heavy in a way that clothes shouldn't be. It tore slightly on the iron latch of the gate, spilling a single, soaked wool cardigan into the muck. I didn't stop to pick it up. I just dragged the plastic carcass onto the porch and went back for the next one. Grandma Margaret hadn't moved. She was staring at the space where my parents' SUV must have been minutes ago. Her silver hair was plastered to her skull, water dripping down the deep lines of her face. I put my hand under her arm. She felt brittle, like dried kindling that would snap if I pulled too hard. "Come on," I said. My voice sounded strange in the wind, flat, detached. Inside.
She didn't argue. She didn't look at me.
She just let me guide her, her feet shuffling in slippers that were now just sponges, soaking up the freezing groundwater. Inside, the cottage was warm, but the air instantly grew heavy with the smell of wet wool and mud. I got her into the armchair by the wood stove. I stripped the wet blanket off her shoulders and replaced it with a dry quilt. I went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. My hands were steady. I watched them as I filled the pot, marveling at how steady they were. I should have been screaming. I should have been calling the police. Instead, I was making tea. That's when my phone buzzed on the counter. A single notification. It was a text from my mother, Cynthia. I picked it up. The screen glowed harsh and bright in the dim kitchen. "She's your problem now. We need the room for Ryan's studio." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I just felt a cold, clinical clarity settle over me, like a layer of ice forming on a lake. You might wonder how a family gets here. How a son and a daughter-in-law can take the woman who raised them, who fed them, and leave her in the rain like a bag of yard waste. Most people think it takes a monster to do that. But I knew better. It doesn't take a monster. It takes a process. It's called the dehumanization of inconvenience. It doesn't happen overnight. It starts small. First, she was mom. Then, as she got older and slower, she became a responsibility. Then, when my brother Ryan decided he was going to be the next big thing in content creation and needed space for his ego, she stopped being a person altogether. In their minds, she became an object. She was an obstacle occupying valuable square footage. She was a fire hazard. She was noise pollution. To dump her at my gate at 4 in the morning, they had to psychologically reclassify her. You don't do that to a human being. You do that to an old sofa that doesn't fit the new aesthetic. They had convinced themselves that erasing her was a logistical necessity, a simple renovation of their lives. They stripped her of her humanity, so they wouldn't have to feel the weight of their own cruelty. I looked back at Margaret. She was staring at the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. They thought she was just an old woman who had outlived her usefulness. They thought she was trash. I set the phone down. The kettle started to whistle. I poured the water, watching the steam rise. They had made a calculation. They traded a mother for a studio. They thought the transaction was finished. They had no idea that the bill was about to come due, and the interest rate was going to be catastrophic. The sun came up like a bruise, turning the gray rain into a slightly lighter shade of gray. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the sound of Margaret sipping her tea. I sat across from her, watching the steam curl around her face. She looked smaller than I remembered, her frame lost in the oversized quilt. Seeing her like this, discarded and shivering, triggered a memory so sharp it almost cut. I was 12 years old. It was Christmas morning. My brother Ryan had opened a pile of gifts, a new gaming console, a dirt bike, designer sneakers. I sat there with a single, practical sweater and a book. My mother had smiled at me, that tight, dismissive smile she saved for moments when she felt a flicker of guilt she didn't want to acknowledge. "You're so low maintenance, Ashley," she'd said. "You don't need things like Ryan does. You're self-sufficient." That was the moment I realized I was the glass child. They looked right through me to see the golden boy shining behind me. I wasn't a daughter. I was the absence of problems. I was the window pane they wiped clean so they could get a better view of their son. Ryan was the investment. I was the overhead cost they tried to keep minimal. Years later, nothing had changed. They refinanced their home to fund Ryan's crypto mining phase. They dipped into their retirement to build him a recording booth for a podcast that produced 3 episodes and 0 listeners. And now, they had evicted their own mother because Ryan needed a studio to launch his personal brand. I looked at Margaret. She hadn't spoken a word since I brought her inside. She hadn't cried. She hadn't asked why. A lot of people would look at her silence and see weakness. They would see a broken old woman who was too shocked to fight back. They would wonder why she wasn't screaming, why she wasn't calling the police, why she wasn't demanding to be taken back to the home she had lived in for 30 years. But as I watched her set the teacup down with a steady hand, I realized it wasn't weakness. It was the dignity of the discarded. Screaming is what you do when you think the other person cares. You scream to be heard. You fight because you believe the relationship is worth saving. But silence? Silence is what happens when you realize the other side has lost the right to your voice. It is a final, terrifying judgment. By refusing to beg, by refusing to make a scene on that front lawn, she had denied them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had turned their cruelty into a monologue, refusing to play her part in their drama. She wasn't passively accepting her fate. She was archiving it. She was letting them show exactly who they were, without interruption. It was a test, and they had failed it so completely that words were no longer necessary.
She finally looked up at me.
Her eyes were clear, stripped of any illusion. "Do you have a dry towel?" she asked. Her voice was raspy but firm. "My hair is still damp." "I'll get one," I said. "And Ashley," she added, stopping me as I stood up. "Don't call them. Not yet." I wasn't going to call, I said, feeling the cold anger solidify in my chest. "I'm going over there. I need to get your pills. And I want to see their faces."
She nodded once slowly. She didn't try to stop me.
She knew what had to happen. She just took another sip of tea, wrapped the quilt tighter, and waited. The waiting was the scariest part. It was the quiet accumulation of interest on a debt my parents didn't even know they owed. I drove to my parents' house in a state of hyperfocus. The rain had stopped, leaving the roads slick and black, reflecting the gray sky. I wasn't going there to beg. I wasn't going there to scream. I was going on a reconnaissance mission. I needed to confirm what I already knew, that there was no remorse. I needed to see it with my own eyes to fully unlock the part of me that was capable of what came next. I pulled into the driveway. It wasn't empty. It wasn't somber. It was a construction site. A white van was parked near the garage. 2 guys in blue coveralls were hauling a pristine, white leather sofa out of the back. My father, Jeffrey, was standing on the porch, pointing at the doorframe, directing the traffic. He didn't look like a man who had just abandoned his mother in a storm. He looked like a man who was finally getting his man cave. I walked up the steps. He saw me, and for a split second, his expression faltered, not with guilt, but with annoyance. Like I was a scheduling error. "Ashley," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We're busy."
"I see that," I said.
My voice was level. "I came for her heart medication. You didn't pack it in the garbage bags." "It's on the kitchen island," he said, turning back to the movers. "Careful with that angle." I walked past him into the house. Inside, it was chaos. The hallway that led to Grandma's room, the room she had occupied for 15 years, was already stripped bare. The floral wallpaper she loved was half peeled, revealing the drywall underneath. My mother, Cynthia, was in the kitchen, unboxing a high-end espresso machine. She looked up when I entered, her face flushing slightly. "Oh," she said. "You're here." "The pills," I said, grabbing the orange bottles from the counter. "Look, Ashley," she started, her voice taking on that familiar, wheedling tone she used when she wanted to rewrite history. It had to happen. It was a safety issue. She was a fire hazard. Leaving the stove on, forgetting things, we couldn't risk it with the new equipment coming in. "The equipment," I repeated. "For Ryan's studio," she said, as if that explained everything. "He needs a professional environment. He's building a brand." Just then, Ryan walked in. The golden boy. He was wearing noise-canceling headphones around his neck and holding a tablet. He looked at me, then at the pill bottles in my hand. "Hey, Ash," he said, breezing past me to the fridge. "Did you get her settled?" "Good. She's better off with you anyway. You like it quiet. I need the energy in here to be different." He took a sip of bottled water and leaned against the counter, flashing me that grin that had gotten him out of trouble for 26 years. "Honestly, it's a win-win," he said. "I get the square footage for the podcast setup, and you get company. Plus, that room was wasted on her. She just sat there." I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who was now fussing over the espresso machine instructions. I looked at my father through the window, laughing with the movers. There was no guilt. There was no hesitation. They hadn't agonized over this decision. They had simply calculated that Ryan's potential internet fame was worth more than Margaret's life. They had traded a human being for soundproofing foam and a ring light. I felt the final tether snap. The last microscopic thread of obligation I felt toward these people dissolved. "You're right, Ryan," I said. The calm in my voice surprised even me. "It is a win-win." He blinked, expecting a fight. He didn't know what to do with agreement. "Exactly," he said, relaxing. "Glad you get it." I didn't say goodbye. I turned and walked out. I passed my father on the porch. "Don't bring her back," he called after me, almost casually. "We've already repurposed the space." "I won't," I said. I got into my car and locked the doors. My hands were steady on the wheel. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully purged the inconvenience from their lives. They were celebrating the renovation. They didn't know that the demolition had just begun. Back at the cottage, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of abandonment anymore. It was the silence of a war room before the strike. I placed the orange pill bottles on the coffee table. Margaret was still in the armchair, but she had changed. The trembling was gone. Her eyes were dry and sharp, tracking my movements with a clarity that unsettled me. "They didn't ask about you," I said. I didn't see the point in softening the blow. "They're renovating your room. Ryan needs soundproofing." Margaret nodded, as if I had just confirmed a weather forecast she had already predicted. "Good," she said. "That makes this easier." She pointed to the corner of the room where the 3 trash bags sat. "Bring me the heavy one, Ashley. The one with the double knot." I walked over and hoisted the bag. It was surprisingly dense, heavier than clothes or shoes should be. I brought it to her, and she untied the knot with fingers that were suddenly nimble. She reached past the layers of old sweaters and pulled out a thick, waterproof portfolio. It was black, nondescript, the kind of thing you'd see in a lawyer's office, not stuffed in a garbage bag by a woman supposedly suffering from cognitive decline. She unzipped it and laid the contents on her lap. They weren't photos. They weren't sentimental keepsakes. They were legal documents. Stacks of them. "Ryan has been bragging about a partnership he's trying to secure," Margaret said, her voice steady. "He needs a logistics partner for his merch drop. He's been trying to get a meeting with Vanguard Logistics for months." I looked at the top document. It was a shareholder summary for Vanguard Logistics. "He says they're the only ones who can handle his volume," she continued. "They are," I said, confused. "They're the biggest firm in the state." "They are," she agreed. "And I own 51% of the voting stock." I stared at her. The woman who my parents claimed was a financial drain, a burden who needed to be discarded to save money on groceries, was the majority shareholder of the very company their golden boy was desperate to impress. "I didn't trust your father with the information," she said simply. Jeffrey has always had a hole in his pocket where his integrity should be. I kept it in a blind trust. My maiden name. But she wasn't done. She flipped past the Vanguard documents to a thicker file at the bottom. That's just the leverage, she said. This is the kill switch. She handed me a deed. But it wasn't just a deed. It was a purchase agreement for a distressed mortgage note. The address listed was my parents' house. 3 years ago, Jeffrey and Cynthia refinanced the house to pay for Ryan's failed crypto mining rig and a lifestyle upgrade, Margaret said. They stopped paying the primary mortgage 6 months later. The bank was preparing to foreclose quietly. They were going to lose the house before Ryan even moved back in. I looked at the dates. The paper trail was meticulous.
I bought the note, she said.
Through a shell LLC. I didn't pay it off for them, Ashley. I bought the debt. I am the bank. I let them stay because I hoped they would figure it out. I let them live there on a grace period I extended indefinitely. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My parents didn't own that house. They were squatting in a property owned by the woman they had just thrown into the mud. They had evicted their own landlord. They violated the terms, I said, reading the fine print. Unauthorized commercial use. The studio. And failure to maintain the property, Margaret added. And non-payment for 24 months. She looked up at me. The grandmother, who baked cookies, was gone. Sitting in that chair was a CEO who had just decided to liquidate a failing asset. They threw me out like trash, Ashley, she said softly. So, I think it's time we collected the trash. I didn't smile. This wasn't funny. It was clinical. I reached for my phone and pulled up the contact for the best real estate attorney in the city. I'm making the call, I said. Make it, she replied. Tell them the landlord is initiating foreclosure. Immediate eviction. I dialed. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't a glass child looking for approval. I was the executor of the estate and I was about to close the account. 2 weeks later, I stood on the front lawn of my childhood home. It was a Tuesday night, but the house was lit up like a nightclub. Bass thumped against the windows, vibrating the glass. Cars lined the street, not family cars, but sleek, rented vehicles belonging to the influencers Ryan had invited to his studio launch party. He was live streaming. I knew because I had the stream open on my phone. He was currently in Grandma's old room, now painted matte black with acoustic foam panels, bragging about his humble beginnings and the empire he was building. My parents were downstairs, pouring drinks, playing the part of the supportive, wealthy benefactors. They looked happy. They looked relieved. They thought they had successfully pruned the dead weight from their lives. I put my phone away. Beside me, Deputy Miller adjusted his belt. Next to him was a process server named David, holding a thick stack of documents. Ready, ma'am? The deputy asked. Ready, I said. We didn't knock. The front door was wide open to welcome the guests. We walked right into the foyer. The music was deafening. People I didn't know were milling around with red plastic cups, treating the house like a public venue. My father saw us first. He was coming out of the kitchen with a tray of appetizers. He froze. The smile slid off his face like oil. Ashley? He shouted over the music. Then he saw the uniform. His face went from annoyed to pale. What is this? Is there a noise complaint? We have a permit. I didn't answer. I just reached over and pulled the plug on the sound system. The silence that followed was sudden and violent. The partygoers stopped mid-conversation. Ryan appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a ring light.
Yo.
Who cut the? He stopped. He saw the sheriff.
Whoa. Ash.
What are you doing? You're ruining the vibe. Party's over, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden quiet, it carried to every corner of the room. Everyone needs to leave.
Now.
You can't do that. Cynthia rushed forward, flushed with wine and indignation. This is our house. You get out. And take your friends with you. She pointed a manicured finger at the deputy. It was almost funny. She still thought she had authority. David, the process server, stepped forward. Jeffrey and Cynthia? Yes, my father snapped. Who are you? You've been served, David said, thrusting the stack of papers into my father's chest. Jeffrey instinctively grabbed them. What is this? Jeffrey looked at the cover page. Notice of default? Foreclosure? What the hell are you talking about? We have an arrangement with the bank. You don't have an arrangement with the bank, I said. Because the bank doesn't own your mortgage anymore. I took a step closer. The ML Holdings Group owns your mortgage, I said. Margaret. Lorraine. Holdings. Grandma owns the note, Dad. She bought it 2 years ago. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like a ghost. What? She owns the debt, I continued, enjoying the way the words hit him like physical blows. And you just violated the terms of the deed of trust. Clause 4, Section B. No unauthorized commercial activity on the residential premises. I pointed up the stairs at Ryan's studio. The studio, I said. It's a breach of contract. The lender is calling the note. Immediately. She can't. Cynthia stammered, looking from me to Jeffrey. She didn't have any money. She had enough to buy you, I said. Ryan ran down the stairs, looking frantic. This is a joke, right? You're joking. Mom, tell her to stop. I have something for you too, Ryan, I said. I pulled a single, crisp envelope from my jacket pocket. You applied for partnership with Vanguard Logistics, I said, to handle your merch distribution. Yeah, he said, puffing up slightly. They're reviewing my application. I'm a shoo-in. Not anymore, I said, handing him the letter. This is a formal rejection and a permanent corporate ban. He tore it open. His eyes scanned the page, widening in horror. Majority shareholder decision? He read, his voice cracking. Who is the majority shareholder? Grandma, I said. The room was dead silent. The guests were awkwardly shuffling out the front door, sensing the disaster. She owns Vanguard, I said. 51%. And she doesn't do business with people who throw her in the garbage. Ryan dropped the paper. He looked at his parents. He looked at the studio he had displaced his grandmother to build. It was worthless. Please, my mother whispered. The arrogance was gone. The hostess veneer had cracked, revealing the terrified woman underneath. Ashley, please. Where are we supposed to go? This is our home. It was Grandma's home, I said. You just lived here. The deputy stepped forward. Folks, you've been served with an immediate notice to vacate due to the foreclosure acceleration. You have 24 hours to remove your personal effects. 24 hours? Jeffrey shouted. That's illegal. We have rights. Read the contract, I said coldly. You signed a waiver of notice when you refinanced the second time. You didn't read the fine print because you were too busy spending the money. My father slumped against the wall. He looked at the foreclosure notice in his hand, then at me. For the first time, he didn't look like the patriarch. He looked like a man who had gambled everything on the wrong horse. We're family, he croaked. I know, I said. That's why I'm giving you 24 hours. A stranger would have given you one. I turned to the deputy. Thank you, officer. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard my mother start to sob. I heard Ryan cursing. I heard the house that had been my prison crumbling into dust. I walked out into the night air. It was cool and clean. I didn't look back. The eviction had begun. The fallout wasn't loud. It was a slow, suffocating silence that settled over my parents' lives like dust in an abandoned house. They're living in a short-term rental now, a 2-bedroom apartment 3 towns over. Their credit is ruined. The foreclosure is on their permanent record. But the financial ruin isn't what broke them. It was the isolation. I released the security footage. I didn't add music. I didn't add commentary. I just uploaded the raw video of my father's SUV idling in the rain at 4:15 in the morning, the trunk popping open, and the two of them leaving an old woman in the mud. I captioned it with one sentence. This is how Jeffrey and Cynthia treat family. The community did the rest. They lost their friends. They lost their standing at the country club. They became pariahs. They walk into the grocery store now, and people turn their carts around. Ryan didn't stick around to help them pick up the pieces. The moment the money dried up and the internet turned on them, the golden boy packed his bags. He blamed them for ruining his vibe and sabotaging his launch. He moved to a different state, chasing another get-rich-quick scheme, leaving them alone in the wreckage he helped create. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel sad. I feel balanced. I sat on the porch of the lighthouse cottage, watching the gray clouds finally break apart over the Pacific. The storm had passed. The air smelled like salt and pine needles. Grandma Margaret was sitting next to me, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, holding a fresh cup of tea. She looked peaceful. The tension that had held her shoulders tight for years was gone. I looked at her and thought about the mistake my parents made. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a fundamental accounting error. They lived their lives by a visible ledger. They calculated value based on status, potential, and what they could extract from a person. They looked at Ryan and saw an asset, a future star who would bring them glory. They looked at Margaret and saw a liability, a depreciating asset that cost them time and space. But they ignored the invisible ledger. There is a currency in families that you can't see, but it is the only one that matters. It's the accumulated capital of loyalty, history, and quiet sacrifice. Margaret had spent a lifetime making deposits into that account. She raised them. She bailed them out. She held the family together. My parents spent a lifetime making withdrawals. They thought they could overdraft their account forever without penalty. They didn't realize that eventually the bank closes your account. By the time they understood that the currency had changed, that humanity was worth more than hype, they were already bankrupt. Margaret took a sip of her tea and looked out at the horizon. "It's a nice view, Ashley," she said softly. "It is," I said. "I'm glad we're here to see it." "Me too." We didn't need to say anything else. We didn't need to talk about them. They were the past, washed away by the rain. We were the future, standing on solid ground that we owned, roof and foundation. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean ocean air. We didn't just survive the storm. We became the lighthouse. If you've ever had to be the one to break the cycle in your family, share your story below. And if you want to see more stories where the quiet ones win, make sure to follow.